I'm sure most of us have heard the slogan, "should have gone to Specsavers." It formed the basis for the longest running advert campaign in the UK by a company called Specsavers, which was launched back in 2002. And it's still going strong today. And if you don't know, the advert usually features people from all walks of life in a variety of situations who make quite disastrous mistakes because of their poor eyesight. And the advert is, of course, suggesting that if they'd only gone to Specsavers, they would have completely avoided those unfortunate situations. Now, today, we're going to see what some regard as Paul's more controversial actions. Some have suggested that in the passage we're about to look at, that Paul himself is having should have gone to Specsavers moment. And worse, some are claiming that perhaps Paul loses his temper, he compromises his testimony, he deliberately and cynically causes a riot at a court, and so on. But as we will see, none of these are true. Paul was a man of faith who walked by faith, not by sight. Now, our book study of Acts started March 16th. And believe it or not, we're actually ahead of schedule. And we'd like to finish in the next few months, which probably will be a relief to some of you. But since chapter 13, Luke's narrative has been focused on the Acts, not just simply of the apostles in general, but the Acts of the Apostle Paul. And the story so far is this. Paul has arrived in Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey. We assume at Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks, which would have been about May, we're guessing, AD 58. And he's been away from Jerusalem for 5 years. So way back in chapter 19 in Ephesus, if you remember that far back, he declared that he had a plan to visit Macedonia, Greece, Jerusalem, and then he wanted to visit Rome. But as he drew closer to Jerusalem, he had this apprehension, which was confirmed by others who warned him not to go, that something bad was going to happen. And as he got closer, the prognosis from others became worse and worse. But when he got there, things seemed okay. He was welcomed by the leadership of the church at Jerusalem, and they asked Paul if, as a favour to them, to show to the many Pharisees and the Jews there that Paul was not there to undermine their faith, that he would sponsor 4 men who had taken a Nazirite vow and be charges with them. That is, sponsor them into the temple, pay for their expensive, pay for the sacrifices, and be with them as they went. And it seemed a great idea. You thought, what could go wrong? And at first it seemed it was all right. But then at the end of the 7 days of the service, there was an uproar in the temple's precincts, and it was suppressed by the Roman tribune of the city, and Paul was taken into custody. And the tribune has no idea what the fuss is all about. He sees Paul about to be lynched and murdered, but he still doesn't know why. He has him put in chains, but then is alarmed to find out that the man he was about to have flogged was actually a Roman citizen. And so he releases Paul, and the tribune orders the Jewish priests and the Sanhedrin to assemble in order to find out what exactly the problem was. He's still mystified what's going on, and the first verse that we read, led us into our passage today. So we've got a lot to get through this morning, and as with other long sections that we've done before, we won't go through verse by verse. We'll treat it as one narrative, and it splits quite neatly into 3 sections. There's a Paul on trial, a plot to kill Paul, and Paul is transferred to Caesarea. So the trial. Paul is brought before the Sanhedrin, with the tribune probably there to oversee and learn what their problem was. And Paul opens up his defence as he addresses them, the national leadership. They are the elders of the people. They are the senate of the people. And instead of calling them brothers and fathers, he refers to them as just brothers. And it might seem a detail, and some people could have been insulted by this because don't you know who they were? They were the leadership of the country. But for Paul, he has good reason for this. He's not some random unknown Jewish pilgrim who's just appeared and got nearly lynched, because these people know exactly who Paul is. They know that this was the Paul who years ago took the name Saul, who they themselves had years ago entrusted the destruction of the church. It was that Paul who they had provided letters of permission to persecute Christians in every city. It was that Paul who was the star pupil of the great teacher Gamaliel. Many there would have grown up with him and known him personally. And before his conversion, he was their superior in potential, zeal and progress in the religious scene. And they hated him the more for it. Yet they knew that he had a claim to treat them as equals. It's almost like someone who'd actually been an atheist and become a Christian and then turns up at an atheist convention. You can imagine how popular they'll be there, because this is a man who knew all that they said, knew all that they did, had been exactly where they were, and then turned turncoat on them. But Paul starts by telling them some strange words. He says that he had served God with clear conscience to that very day. And it appears a very bold claim. We might immediately think what he said in Philippians, how he described that his state was, as regards to the law, blameless. But he's not saying that actually. He's saying something quite different. We tend to think of a clear conscience in terms of personal integrity. But he is saying something different. He says, you know who I am and what I have done. I am no sellout. I am not abandoning my heritage. I am still a true Israelite. My faith in Jesus is right and proper because I believe he is the Messiah. I am as true a Jew as any of you. I have not sold out my faith. I have not sold or abandoned my heritage. My conscience is clear on that. I'm the one who has the true hope of the Messiah. And he knows he has to be brief because he knew that they would shut him up as soon as they could, which he correctly anticipates. The high or chief priest, the word high or chief priest is kind of interchangeable. And it's interesting, in the previous verse, it mentioned the chief priests, as though that there were more than one of them. And we'll explain about that in a minute. But he orders that those of his party standing by Paul to hit him in the face, to smite him in the mouth. And this is not some mindless act of brutality or resentment, but he is saying to Paul two things. Shut up, silence. We are not going to hear anything you say. Secondly, we don't need to hear anything you say because we've already decided that you're guilty. We don't need to hear any more. Now, Paul is actually quite shocked by what has happened. By Jewish law, the rights of defendants were safeguarded. They were innocent, as is in this country, until proved guilty. He had not been charged, he had not been tried or convicted. The high priest, on the other, the guardian of the law, had broken the law in having Paul struck. And Paul's response was startling in the way he says it. He says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourselves violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Now, at first sight, and as some say this, that Paul has just lost his rag here. He's just lost his cool. He's been hit in the face, and who wouldn't get a bit angry when that had happened? But he's not doing this. Paul's words are just expressing the future. He's saying, this is not out of ill will. This is not that I wish that God would strike you down. I'm simply saying that God will strike you down. He's speaking prophecy. He's just predicting. And we know from history that this man, Ananias, a corrupt, greedy, avaricious, overbearing man, a man who actually would assassinate people and have people murdered, this man came to grief. He had to flee for his life from the Jewish zealots, and in hiding in an aqueduct, he was murdered by them. And this happened in AD 66, so not long after. Paul's prediction just came to pass. But also, we can be assured that Paul's words were not just spite or petty annoyance, because we know that our Lord Jesus Christ said of the apostles, when they lead you and deliver you up, take no thought beforehand what you shall speak, neither do ye premeditate, but whatever shall be given you in that hour, that speak ye. For it is not you that speak, but the Holy Ghost. Luke is recording the Acts of the Apostles as apostles, and the Acts of Paul the Apostle which takes up half of this book, in this, Paul is speaking as an apostle. Now, the close supporters of the high priest are actually outraged. They say, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" To them, this man was above the law. He could do whatever he liked without question or scrutiny. But Paul's reply was even more surprising than the one he gave earlier. Now, he said, "Brothers, I did not realize he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the rule of your people.'" And some people would imagine this is an apology. And people have given various reasons as to why Paul might not have realized that the man he was speaking to was the chief priest. Some have said that Paul's eyesight was poor. He didn't see that the man was speaking to him was the high priest. If you like, it was Paul's should have gone to Specsavers moment. I'm sorry, I didn't actually realize that he was the high priest. Others say that Paul was actually looking in a different direction when the man spoke and didn't actually realize who was speaking to him. Others have said, well, after all, Paul hadn't been to Jerusalem for 5 years, and so he might not even know that this man was the high priest. But if you look at it carefully, Paul isn't giving an apology at all. If he was, it was a pretty lame one. In other words, it would be kind if he was saying an apology. "Oops, sorry, didn't realise who he was. And of course I know that the Bible says that I shouldn't actually insult people like that." But Paul is speaking directly to the high priest, so he knows who he is. He knows who has spoken to him. And he is quite aware who is in charge of the judgment. So he knows exactly who he's speaking to. And although Paul had been away from Jerusalem for 5 years, this man had been in high priest over 11 years ago. So he was well known to everyone. So the question is, what is Paul really saying? So there are some things we need to understand, first of all, about this. In those days, 1st century AD, when the Roman occupied the land, high priests were a political appointment. They were appointed by the Romans. He was not high priest according to the law of Moses. And whereas Mosaic high priests served for their lives, their entire life, these high priests could be removed and replaced just depending on the whim of the governor. Ananias had been actually appointed by the Emperor Claudius, and he had amassed great wealth. He took the tithe that rightly belonged to the priests. He would use violence and assassination. And only a few years earlier, he'd actually been removed and sent to Rome to explain his conduct and misuse of office and abuse of power. And when his friends, Ananias' friends, described him as God's high priest, there were various factions in the nation who had their own person that they thought should be high priest. In fact, that year there was in operation a high priest called Jonathan, who actually happened to get assassinated, unfortunately. But even those who retired, even those who were removed from office, still retained this title, high priest or chief priest. So the question, was he really high priest? Paul, in his reply, combines the past and present tenses. He said, "I did not know, and I do not know now that he is the high priest." He's saying, in effect, I know the law that you say I'm breaking in criticising the high priest, but I am not guilty of breaking it. I do not recognise him as high priest in any sense, and so I have done no wrong. And possibly there's a hint. The law states that the high priest is someone who can have no evil spoken of him. How can this man truly be high priest? You all know his history. You know his reputation. Now, since the high priest had all but shut down Paul's defence, Paul realised he can't continue just making his defence like he started. But he knows the people who were there. There are two main factions, Sadducees, who make up the majority, and the Pharisees, who make a sizable minority of the national leadership. As it says in the passage, the Sadducees claimed to represent traditional orthodoxy of Israel, but they denied the doctrine of the bodily resurrection, the belief in a spirit world of angels or demons, and were often morally lax. Whereas the Pharisees, called the separated ones, were strict observers of the law and its interpretation. Now again, some people criticise Paul yet again, saying that clearly he's being cynically opportunistic. he knows that he can quite easily cause a riot by just pressing a few buttons and getting everyone annoyed. He can see that these people are common enemies, and he can claim actually agreement with one of them and completely disrupt the law, derail the proceedings. And he starts off by saying, I'm a Pharisee. Not only that, I am from a family of Pharisees. Not only my father was a Pharisee, my mother was a Pharisee. I'm the most consistent Pharisee of you all. Before my conversion, I knew, as other Pharisees did, that the hope of Israel, the Messiah, was bound up with the resurrection of the dead. And since my conversion, I know this in a fullness that I could never have understood before. I know what you believe, and I know you could appreciate and understand so much more if you took that step of recognizing who Jesus is. But we both believe in the resurrection of the dead. We both believe that the Messiah is bound up with that. And the original charge, apparently, for which Paul was really there for which he was nearly murdered, no one is even interested in it. It's almost that no one believed it anyway. Now, interestingly enough, clearly Paul not only believed in the resurrection of Christ, but he believed that the resurrection of Christ and the resurrection of the dead were inseparable. The resurrection of Christ guaranteed the resurrection of the dead of us all. And the resurrection of us could not happen without the resurrection of Christ. Now, the Pharisees rally around Paul. Their scribes, their scholars, they assert, this man is innocent. Most of the scribes who would have been Pharisees and could have accepted that actually God had spoken to Paul by an angel. In fact, Paul had already told his story, how he had been spoken to in the Damascus experience. And so they knew that story well, and they believed it. They said, that could quite well be true. We have no doubt about that. And Luke actually never disparages the Pharisees. To him, they represented the best of Judaism, people who were not far from the kingdom of God. But what starts as a shouting match quickly becomes physical. It's hard to imagine, but these elderly, learned, pious gentlemen start by shouting at each other. And the whole thing descends into chaos. It even starts to get physical. The Pharisees, who are the scholars, they apparently leave their seats and go over to join with Paul, and their opponents go on, and there's almost a fight breaks out. And the tribune, who's been there but so far taken no part, doesn't understand what's going on, but he at least realises that Paul is actually probably in danger. And so his soldiers wade in and they take him to the fortress. Now, for Paul, perhaps he feels that things had not turned out well. That meeting could not have gone worse. His worst fears that what might happen in Jerusalem had happened. He had tried to bear witness to his people and he had been rejected. Perhaps his friends were right when they warned him. Perhaps he shouldn't have gone there. Perhaps he should have been more careful. Perhaps he should have been more careful what he said. Perhaps he shouldn't have been so blunt. Would he die in Jerusalem? In that case, who would ever take the gospel to Rome? But that night, Paul has a vision. The Lord not only stands by him, the Lord stands over him. And he says to him, effectively, Paul, do not be discouraged. You have testified of me. You have done well. You may have thought things have gone badly, but you have done well. And I will ensure that your mission continues and is accomplished in my own way. Perhaps sometimes as a Christian, perhaps sometimes when you're with unbelievers, perhaps sometimes you feel that you haven't done very well. Perhaps you feel you've said the wrong thing. Perhaps things haven't gone as you hoped in a conversation. Don't be discouraged, because God is still pleased with what you've done. Now, there is a plot now. The Jews are disappointed that Paul has actually once again slipped through their fingers. But they're determined to engineer another opportunity to kill Paul. And so These are presumably those who were in the temple in the first place, but there are 40 or so of them, and they bind themselves with a binding promise that they will make sure he dies this time. They have a plan. They go to the chief priests and the elders, and they say to them, request from the tribune that you want to hear from Paul. So a few more answers to their questions. And on the way, as they take him to the council chamber, we will jump on him. We will kill him before anyone else gets involved. It will be complete deniability for you, because this will happen before you even see him. Now, these men are fanatical. It was effectively a suicide mission, because they knew that Paul would be heavily guarded, and they were willing to lose their lives for it to achieve this purpose. But then something providentially happens. We don't know much about Paul's family, but it appears he had a sister, and her son, Paul's nephew, somehow hears of this plot and is more than anxious for his uncle's safety. Paul may have suffered the loss of all things, but it appears that his sister's family was still loyal to him. And Paul at this time is kept in honourable custody for his own safety in the Antonia fortress, and he is allowed to have visitors, and the centurions overseeing him are ensured that this is carried out. The tribune was taking his personal duty now, that he had to keep Paul safe. He had taken every aspect of Paul's safety very seriously. But we see now that the tribune has really come to like Paul. It's not just he's doing it because he has to, because don't you know he's a Roman citizen. You can see Paul has endeared himself to him. He feels that he owes him a debt more than just duty. And so the centurion, instead of brushing off this request by Paul, he takes his message to the tribune. The tribune speaks to the young man, Paul's nephew, kindly, and takes him seriously. You can imagine a man who's in charge of a battalion of soldiers, effectively 1,000 men, could be quite impatient, dismissive of a young man, maybe in his teens, who comes with a message, but he takes him seriously. And so he acts immediately. He says to this young man, whatever you do, don't tell anything to anybody. The surprise is of most importance now. Immediately, 2 centurions are summoned. He can't risk anything happening to Paul in Jerusalem. It's no longer safe for him there. And just as background, actually now, since the death of Herod Antipas, the whole country was run by the Roman government. It was a Roman province. And the seat of the Roman government was actually in Caesarea. And so immediately he dispatches Paul to there where he will be safe. And he takes no half measures. He sends a strong escort, light infantry, cavalry, heavy infantry, almost half the garrison in all are sent to protect Paul. That night, 9 o'clock at night, and it's amazing how quickly they arranged this whole expedition. It shows how well organised they were. And they have to cover the 60 miles to Caesarea as quickly as possible. They leave 9 p.m, just after dark, and they travel through the night. They cover 42 miles by foot, and then the location they're in, they're outside the Judean hills, a place of safety where it's mainly a Gentile population. They're left with the cavalry, who then take Paul on his remaining part of the journey. And they present Paul to the governor there, the Governor Felix, with the following letter. A quite remarkable letter, very brief. To His Excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I learned that he's a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found the accusation had to do with questions about their law. There was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. And the governor reads this letter and asks Paul, what province are you from? And there's a reason to that, because if Paul had come from, say, a client kingdom like Syria or Asia Minor, it would have been better to hand him over to the relevant authorities. But as Paul came from a Roman province, the province of Syria, whose governor was Felix's boss, he was actually had the authority to deal with it himself. And so he announces that he will make a full hearing when the accusers arrived. But in the meantime, he'd be detained in the great palace built by Herod the Great, which now serves as the procurator's headquarters. Now, who this governor was? What was he like? What will happen to Paul next? Well, you have to wait for the next instalment, which Mike will give. But in conclusion, there are two kind of points I'd like to make. The Lord is near. We saw Paul discouraged after his disappointing encounter with the Jewish council. Things apparently had gone wrong. And that night, Paul experienced a vision of God's presence, and God himself comforts him. In the sight of God, he had done well. He had given a good testimony. And Paul would arrive where he needed to at the right time. God was putting everything in place to make that happen. God was with him. And for us, there is no greater comfort than to know that God is with us. In all our circumstances, he is in control. And in all that we go through, he will be beside us in our difficult times, but also in our good times. Now, comfort in the Bible is not just a hot chocolate in a duvet, having a blissful release from the situation you're in. It is actually much more than that, more useful. It is a strengthening. God is giving you the strength and encouragement so that you are able not simply to avoid the problems you're in, but to overcome whatever lies before you. Paul was not promised release. He was not promised freedom. He was not promised his problems being solved. And for us, perhaps sometimes we get disappointed because we ask for things that God has never promised to give us. God has never promised us a trouble-free life. But in our lives, he will protect us and preserve us. Our natural reaction is to have our problems removed, but God's solution is to give us strength to rise above them. And in all of that, you will know that you are not alone, that God is with you and beside you, and he will protect you. But I'd like to make a little point on this, that God is not just with us in our difficult and trying times, he is with us in our good times, in our happy times. Except these, ironically, are the times when we are most likely to forget God. Sometimes God sends us trials to wake us up, but it's much better that we should desire God to be with us in all our circumstances, good and bad, not just when we need his help. Augustine famously said, "Thou hast made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless till we find our rest in you." The second point is the resurrection of the dead. I tried to point out that this resurrection point that Paul made before the Sanhedrin was not just a diversion. This is something Paul passionately believed in. Now, a few weeks ago, Mike preached on Acts 22, and he opened his sermon by the following question: how far would you go as a Christian in this church to do what Paul urges us to do in Romans 14? Make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. In other words, it is good and right that we do all we can, even to the point of sacrificing personal preferences and freedoms for the sake of others, to maintain the unity of the church. But that does not mean there are no limits. In our efforts to maintain church unity, we cannot compromise on primary church doctrines. And we have before us an example of this, an article of faith which the Apostle Paul, who was all things to all men, would never give an inch on. There are some things that we believe in that are so foundational, there can be no meaningful Christian unity without them. And so, to misquote Bill Shankly, some people think that the resurrection is just a matter of life and death. I can assure you it is far more important than that. Now, earlier we encountered the Sadducees, a Jewish sect of the day that did not apparently believe in angels, spirits, and afterlife, and could never be reconciled to Christianity because it categorically denied the resurrection of the dead. We naturally asked, well, how could anyone believe in that sort of thing? What was the point of a religion like that? What possible use had it? But we know that in our own national church, and many other denominations as well, there are very high up people with that kind of religion. An example I'll give you, by no means unique, was the late Reverend David Jenkins, Bishop of Durham, known as the unbelieving bishop. He was quite public about his lack of belief in the virgin birth and the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And before his installation, before his consecration, 3 days there's widespread disquiet in the Anglican Church about the theological positions he had. People wrote a 12,000 long signatory list complaining about this, about their concern. 3 days after his consecration in York Minster, some of you perhaps remember this, York Minster was struck by lightning and caused an immense fire, causing immense damage after this man was installed as a bishop. There are some things which, if we take them away from our Christian faith, our faith has no value at all. And any semblance of unity is a complete fiction. If Jesus did not rise, then we are of all people to be pitied. Because if there was no resurrection of Jesus, then there is no resurrection for us. Ironically, in the church times, his obituary ended like this. He played the melodies of modernity together with the tunes of tradition, and thereby reached the ears of those long deaf to the good news of God as he in Jesus. And the question is, if you do not believe in the resurrection, what actual good news have you got left to tell anyone? We do not know what glorified state we will be in, because it is not death that we're looking forward. We are looking forward to the resurrection of the dead. The focus when we rise from the dead will not be ourselves. We will be in a glorified state, but we will not be looking at ourselves. We will not even be looking at others. We'll be looking at Jesus. And Paul treasured this and rejoiced in this, and he expressed it far better than I can in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, "Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trump shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible. We shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible shall put on incorruption, and this mortal shall put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labour is not in vain in the Lord."